Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another live stream on the History Value podcast. And today I'm joined by John Andrew MacDonald. And today we're going to be discussing the Clementine literature. We're going to be talking a bit about both First Clement and the so-called Pseudo-Clementine recognitions. And with that being said, John, thank you for joining me. And do you want to tell the audience a little bit about your website and your X profile, where they can find your stuff?
That's great. Thank you, Jacob. I'm John MacDonald. I'm the president of Internet Infidels and the Secular Web. And we're a nonprofit group that looks at spreading the message of secularism and naturalism. I'm particularly interested in the historical Jesus and the historical Paul. That's not the Jesus of faith, and the Paul of faith, but who they were, what their message was, apart from any superstition or supernaturalism. I have a blog called Secular Frontier, and if any of this interests you, you don't need to take notes during the presentation, because I'll be putting the slides up on the Secular Frontier blog probably tomorrow. So just sit back and enjoy, I guess.
All right. Well, I'm going to go ahead and put it on the screen and begin.
Okay. So my presentation is called In the Spirit of Clement, and I'm going to be looking at the Pseudo-Clementine recognitions and the question of history. And some of the topics I'll be looking at is the death of the historical Paul and James, the death of the historical Jesus, the message of the historical Jesus, and the message of the historical Paul in contrast. My goal for this presentation is I'd like the reader to come, or the listener to come away with the idea that there was a historical Paul and historical Jesus, and we can have an idea of what their very different messages were. So I'll start. Jesus is the Son of God, snubbing Caesar. Now, this is from Dr. Robert M. Price's New Testament narrative as Old Testament Midrash essay. This is the very beginning of it. He's citing Randall Helms, and he says, the syncretic flavor of Mark is at once evident from his reproduction of a piece of Augustan imperial propaganda and in setting it beside a tailored scriptural quote. The beginning of the gospel of Jesus, the Son of God, closely matches the formula found on a monument erected by the provincial assembly in Asia Minor in 1st century BCE, which says, whereas Providence has brought our life to the peak of perfection in giving us Augustus Caesar, who, being sent to us and to our descendants as a savior, and whereas the birthday of the God has been for the whole world the beginning of the gospel, the euangelion, concerning him, let all reckon a new era beginning from the date of his birth. And one thing you see a lot in the contemporary literature is the challenge that Jesus is presenting to Rome in the literature. And so, for example, you'll see this from John Dominic Crossan. But my question is, if the message is peace through love of Jesus versus the peace through victory of Rome, as many scholars suggest, then why in all our sources are the Jewish elite blamed for Jesus's death and Pilate exonerated? So that's a bit of a preparatory question. So the Pseudo-Clementine recognitions, which are also called the Clementine recognitions, is often thought of as a fourth century pseudo-pagraphic Christian novel falsely attributed to Clement of Rome, though Jacob Berman places it mid-2nd century. It survives mainly in Latin translation by Rufinus of Aquileia, with partial Syriac and Greek fragments. It is one of two major versions of the Clementine literature, the other being the Homilies, and both derive from an earlier lost Greek source called the Grundschrift, Basic Writings or Circuits of Peter, and the Epistle of Zacchaeus. Berman finds a historical James and Paul here who died in the AD 30s.
And I'd like to go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. Yep.
Yeah, since you cited my this is coming from a video I did with Derek recently, also including a video I did a little bit earlier before that. I want to explain why I put it in the 2nd century.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
But just to kind of remind the audience. So I noticed something that hasn't really been noticed before, at least not to my knowledge, that the Pseudo-Clementine recognitions admits to deriving material from the epistles of Zacchaeus and Peter, which you talk about in this slide. Scholars focus on a more hypothetical grundskrift, or circuits of Peter. And to me, I look at it as being one and the same as that epistolary material that's attributed to the historical Peter by recognitions. So then when we have to ask ourselves the question, what makes the Pseudo-Clementine recognition Pseudo-Clementine then? How do we get the idea that somebody called Clement actually wrote it? Well, they say it's 4th century. Now, not all scholars are certain that this is that late. A lot of them will say it is. The problem is Origen knew about it. In Origen's Philokalia, he mentions the 10th book of the Nativity. That's in the Pseudo-Clementine recognitions. Now, it's not the Nativity of Jesus. It's the Nativity of Greco-Roman deities, which is discussed in Book 10. So Origen is actually giving an accurate description of it. He knows about 10-volume travels of Clement. So he knew about it. That means it can't be any later than the 3rd century. And saying it's 3rd century is already pushing it. But Origen definitely knew about it. It's practically impossible to deny. Now, the Philokalia, I believe, is 4th century, but that doesn't change anything. It's a anthology of Origen's work that was written later. But it is quoting Origen's commentary on Genesis, which is good because the commentary on Genesis isn't preserved. The parts of it that is preserved is by the Philokalia. So anyway, in the 3rd century, quoted by this 4th century Philokalia, the recognitions is known to Origen. But here's the other thing. In the recognitions, the so-called Pseudo-Clement fails to refer to himself as bishop, which is curious. This is because it wasn't actually Bishop Clement of Rome. That's not the original intent. Although I do think the author later decided to claim that he was Clement of Rome, the bishop, especially by the time you get to these Pseudo-Clementine epistles that you see later, like the Clement's letter to, I believe it was Clement's letter to James, if I remember correctly, the title. But it does claim, he is claiming that he's a bishop. And that's why it's Pseudo-Clementine. It's Pseudo-Clementine because the author of it later says that he's bishop. So who is this other Clement, second Clement? Well, to finish quickly, the shepherd of Hermas mentions this other Clement. That's gone unnoticed. You have a Clement in the mid-2nd century under Bishop Pius I of Rome, and he is sending letters to multiple different locations, kind of acting like this traveling Clement that the recognitions is talking about. And the Moratorian fragment confirms that this is happening at that time because the Shepherd of Hermas was written by Hermas, and Hermas, according to the Moratorian fragment, is the brother of Bishop Pius I. So you put all that together, he's got to be our guy. That's writing the recognition. So that would put it around circa 150 AD or CE. So that's a brief, quick argument, a quick overview of my argument there. And there's going to be more details on this in my paper on Paul, and that's about Paul and the martyrdom of James and the Paul's gospel. That's going to be coming out in Bob's journal, Bob Price's journal of Higher Criticism, in which I will go into more detail regarding this matter. So back to you, John. I just wanted to explain that real quick.
Oh, no, that was awesome. And hopefully your article will be out soon. I've been waiting for it for a while. Okay, so themes of the recognitions. It preserves the strong Jewish Christian, sometimes called Ebionite-influenced elements, like Jesus is the true prophet, a manifestation of divine truth appearing in figures like Adam, Moses, etc. affirmation of the Mosaic Law for the Jews, free will, resurrection, strict monotheism, polemics against paganism, idolatry, and heresies, including anti-Marcionite themes. It stresses ritual purity, ethical living, and Peter is the true guardian of Jesus' teaching, and Simon Magus serves as a villainous foil. Now, this is from Jacob Berman as well. So if you look on the right side of the screen, we have the earliest sources being the Epistles of Zacchaeus and Peter from AD 36 to 7, which is preserved by Clement in AD 96, and was put together by Second Clement from AD 142 to 156. Is that about right, Jacob?
I will say that there is one little mistake I did make on here. It was more like I think it's 142 to 157 actually, but that's hardly anything. But yeah, it's pretty much right.
Good. Okay. So now I'd like to talk about one thing we learn about the death of Paul, or I'm sorry, the death of James and the attack by Paul. So the Recognitions has James killed in the AD 30s, shortly after an attack by Paul. Berman argues he's not the same James who was mentioned by Josephus, who died decades later, who is the brother of Jesus by title only, per the first Apocalypse of James.
Yeah.
Now, here's something that I noticed that I'd like to talk a little bit about. Regarding Jesus's death, in the historical summary section of the Pseudo-Clementine Recognition, specifically the historical summary in Book 1, Chapter 41 and 53, the text refers to the unbelieving Jews who fixed him on a cross or hurried him by wicked men to the cross and failed to recognize him as the true prophet. It notes their fear and rage because the world, like with Plutarch's Cleomenes, sympathized with Christ after his death and because his body could not be found. Now, the question that sort of struck me from the Recognitions with that is we have a debate right now called the Christ myth theory debate. And on the one hand, the vast majority of scholars think that Jesus was a person who lived and died in the first century. But there's also mythicists who think that Jesus was never on Earth, but killed by demons in outer space. And I think that what is interesting is if you look at a lot of the scholarship that came out around the time of the Jewish annotated New Testament, emphasizing the Jewish Jesus, it causes us to miss something, and is perhaps a way of overcoming Jesus mythicism and Paul mythicism too, if you look at scholars like Nina Livesey. So the Recognitions has the tradition of assigning the culpability of Jesus' death to the Jews. But why are the Jews universally blamed for Jesus' death in our ancient sources? Now, it's not universal in that they all say the same thing, but there are all sorts of little hints and nods and ideas that are pushing towards that. Why aren't the Romans blamed, for example? Why do they go so hard? Why do the Gospels try so hard to exonerate Pilate? So I'd like to, if you look down to the second bullet, I'd like to talk a little bit about that. Blaming the Jews, often collectively or as a people, for Jesus' death became a widespread and popular theme in early Christian writings and preaching during the post-gospel era, roughly 2nd to 4th centuries and beyond. Often inspired by passages like Matthew's, "His blood will be upon us." And this I have in bold. As we will see, it is not just anti-Semitism, but intra-Jewish clashes in the ancient world. Against mythicism, the idea Jesus was killed by demons in outer space, there is a wealth of evidence moving toward a certain Jewish group as having responsibility for Jesus' death. And the analogy I thought up was like if you have objects in a surrounding space that are moving toward a black hole. Like if you look at one or two, you might not notice the black hole, but all of them together form a pattern. It's like the Pulitzer Prize winning play Doubt, a Parable by John Patrick Shanley, where all lines of evidence converge on a character's guilt, but it remains unconfirmed. So I'll talk a bit about that. We tend to downplay the anti-Semitic interpretation of Christianity post-Gospels, certainly for the noble Jewish Jesus and Paul. But in so doing, we miss the intra-Jewish polemics that were there from the outset. A lot of the racist interpretations came out around 150s and later. Like, for example, Melito of Sardis, in his widely circulated Easter homily, Peri Pascha, on the Pascha, is the first writer to explicitly charge the Jews with deicide. He repeatedly accuses Israel of murdering God. He who hung the earth in place is hanged. The God has been murdered. The king of Israel has been put to death by the Israelite right hand. He portrays the crucifixion as occurring in the middle of Jerusalem by the Jews alone, with the Romans barely mentioned. This text was influential in early liturgy and preaching. And I'll go on, but I just want to say, like, I'm not advocating anti-Semitism or anything like that. Just that I'm trying to point out that there really is something in the ancient literature that is pointing towards this idea. And if we think about it, it really speaks against the idea that Jesus was killed by demons in outer space. Justin Martyr, in his dialogue with Trypho, directly tells his Jewish interlocutor, "These things have happened to you in fairness and justice, for you have slain the just one," and blames the Jews for crucifying the only blameless and righteous man. He links Jewish suffering, e.g. the destruction of Jerusalem, to this crime, and portrays Jews as spreading calumnies against Christians. That's actually a really big one that came up in one of Bart Ehrman's recent conferences. That just like the destruction of the first temple was put on the bad behavior of the Jews, so too was the destruction of the second temple put on the bad behavior of the Jews, which included the death or the killing of Jesus. Subsequent writers follow suit. Tertullian highlights Matthew 27:25 to argue God rejected the Jews for their role in the death. Origen, Hippolytus, Cyprian, Gregory of Nyssa, Ambrose, and especially John Chrysostom, late 4th century, in his Adversus Judaicos homilies, repeated and intensified the charge, often calling the Jews the slayer of the Lord, murderers of the prophets, and enemies of God. Chrysostom's sermons were particularly vitriolic and popular in the East. This motive appears in sermons, treatises, liturgies, like the Good Friday text, and apocryphal works. It was popular in the sense that it was repeated across regions like Syria, North Africa, Asia Minor, and Rome, became embedded in Christian identity formation, and persisted for centuries, fueling pogroms, expulsions, and later blood libels, until modern repudiations like Vatican II's Nostra Aetate, which rejected collective Jewish guilt. It was not universal in the absolute sense. Some fathers like Augustine tempered it with using harsh rhetoric, while still using harsh rhetoric, but it was common enough to be considered a mainstream view in patristic Christianity. So we get these, you could call them racist, I guess, these racist views against the Jews that cropped up later. But then the question was, what were the Jewish elite like, or how were they viewed around the time of Jesus? So I wrote, a number of Jewish groups and individuals in the 1st century CE, around Jesus' lifetime, roughly 40 or 4 BCE to 30 CE, explicitly viewed segments of the Jewish elite. Okay, this isn't blanket on the Jews as a whole, but it's just this sort of ruling class, especially the high priestly aristocracy in Jerusalem, the Sadducean temple leadership, and sometimes the collaborating scribes or Sanhedrin, as corrupt, greedy, impure, or illegitimate. This wasn't a universal opinion. Many ordinary Jews respected the temple and its leaders, but it was widespread enough among certain sects and observers to appear in multiple independent sources. The wrongful death of Jesus seems to be placed here. So, for example, The people behind the Dead Sea Scrolls, which most scholars identify them as Essenes or a closely related group, were sharply critical of the Jerusalem priesthood. They wrote about a wicked priest, probably referring to one or more Hasmonean or later high priests, who was greedy, violated purity laws, persecuted the righteous, and defiled the temple. They called the ruling priests the sons of darkness and saw the official temple cult as corrupt and illegitimate. The Essenes withdrew to the desert, rejected the Jerusalem calendar and sacrifices, and awaited God's judgment on the corrupt elite. These scrolls were composed from 2nd century BC into the 1st century CE, so the criticism was very much at the time of Jesus. Josephus himself came from a priestly family and had served in the temple, yet he repeatedly describes 1st century high priests, especially the powerful Annas Caiaphas family, as engaging in bribery, greed, violence, and abuse of power. They stole tithes meant for poorer priests. They bribed Roman governors to keep or gain office. Some used thugs to extort money or settle scores. He notes that the high priesthood had become politicized under Herod and Roman rule. Positions were bought and sold rather than passed down purely by hereditary right. Josephus portrays this corruption as one factor contributing to the unrest that led to the Jewish revolt in 66 to 70 CE. And now let's think about the early Jesus movement. The Gospels, which are, Jacob has a later date. I just wrote here what the standard date is, but I think he's right in placing the Gospels after Josephus. Showed Jesus publicly criticizing the chief priests, scribes, and Pharisees. He calls the temple a den of robbers, echoing Jeremiah when he overturns the money changer tables. He accuses religious leaders of hypocrisy, burdening people with rules while ignoring justice and mercy and exploiting widows. He predicts the temple's destruction. Well, probably not, but that was probably written in wake of it. But scholars widely agree this reflects real tension and popular perceptions of priestly corruption and collaboration with Rome. The Gospels are partisan pro-Jesus, but they align with the independent evidence from Josephus and the scrolls that many Jews already felt the temple elite had problems. Just as a broader context, under Roman rule after 63 BCE, Roman governors and Herodian kings appointed high priests, turning the office into a political prize often won through bribery and favoritism. This created widespread resentments among the stricter Jewish groups like the Essenes, some Pharisees, zealots, and ordinary pilgrims. Rabbinic sources written later also preserve memories of priestly abuses in the 1st century, for example, priests taking more than their share of the offerings. In short, yeah, significant numbers of Jews at the time, especially the sectarian or reform-minded ones, did see parts of the Jewish elite as corrupt or bad. This view helped fuel religious reform movements, criticism of the temple, and ultimately contributed to the explosive events of 60 through 70 CE. Not every Jew agreed, but the criticism was loud, repeated, and came from insiders as well as outsiders. So it's not an anti-Semitism thing; it's an intra-Jewish thing. And these are the ones that Josephus assigns for Jesus' death. In the Testimonium Flavianum, in Antiquities 1833, section 63, contains this line, which is widely accepted by scholars as basically authentic to Josephus, with only minor Christian interpolations elsewhere in the passage, and I have it in bold here. And when, upon the accusation or at the suggestion of the principal men among us, Pilate had condemned him to the cross. Principal men among us is Josephus' standard phrase for the Jewish ruling elite, the high priests, the aristocrats, and Sanhedrin members in Jerusalem. He states that they brought the accusation charges against Jesus, prompting the Roman governor Pontius Pilate to order his crucifixion. I mentioned before with the destruction of the first and second temple, it was viewed as being because there were Jews that were behaving badly that were a major part. So here I'll talk a little bit about that. Ancient Jews from the biblical period through the Second Temple era and into the rabbinic times overwhelmingly understood major national disasters, including the destruction of the first temple in 586 BCE by the Babylonians, as God's direct punishment for the people's collective sins and covenant breaking. This wasn't a fringe idea. It was the dominant theological framework in the Hebrew Bible itself to remain central for centuries afterward. Some Christians thus viewed the destruction of the Second Temple as punishment for the Jewish elite who wrongfully killed Jesus. Jesus' death was seen as a gross miscarriage of justice, like that of Socrates, which opened our eyes to our inconspicuous vileness. And so the Gospels repopularized Jesus to explain why the temple fell. I'll give you the biblical foundation for that. The books of Deuteronomy through 2 Kings, the so-called Deuteronomistic history, edited during or shortly after the exile, repeatedly explain Israel and Judah's downfall as the logical result of disobedience. God warns in Deuteronomy 28-30 that covenant faithfulness brings blessing and the land security, while idolatry, injustice, and breaking the Torah brings curses, invasion, and exile. The Babylonian destruction and exile are explicitly tied to King Manasseh's sins and the people's in 2 Kings 21, 10-15, with God saying he will wipe out Jerusalem like a dirty bowl. So the pattern is the prophets who lived through or just before the events hammer the same point. Jeremiah, writing right around the destruction, says the land is ruined because they forsook the Torah I had said before them and followed the Baalim. He lists idolatry, social injustice, and moral failure as the reasons that God brought Babylon as his instrument of judgment. Ezekiel, in exile, accuses the leaders and the people of bloodshed, idolatry, and ritual impurity, declaring that God's presence had left the temple before its physical destruction because it had been defiled by sin. This pattern of sin that leads to warning, that leads to punishment, that leads to possible restoration after repentance, runs through the entire Hebrew Bible. Also see Lamentations, which mourns the event which acknowledged guilt. Jesus is very much like, if you look at the angels that came to Lot, he was coming to see whether the people were really as vile as they were thought to be. And the first thing the angels did when they saw the first thing the people did when they got to the angels is they wanted to rape them. And so that brought the destruction. Well, the same is true with Jesus. Jesus came to God sent Jesus to restore the Davidic throne. And when the people saw him, what did they do? Well, they tortured him and crucified him. And so that brought about the destruction of the temple with that. So that's the argument anyway. What was God punishing? Classical Jewish sources pinpoint three cardinal sins for the first temple's fall. The Talmud, Yoma 9a through b. Idolatry, worshipping of other gods or idols, sexual immorality or adultery, and bloodshed or murder, including social violence and injustice. Later rabbinic tradition and prophets also emphasize broader issues, oppressing the poor, false prophecy, and empty ritual without ethical living. And this view continued after the first temple. Even centuries later, the same logic was applied to the Second Temple's destruction in 70 CE. The Jewish historian Josephus, a priest who witnessed it, wrote that God rejected the temple and the city because of the people's wickedness, internal hatred, bloodshed, and pollution of the sanctuary, using the Romans as the instrument of punishment, just as he had used Babylon earlier. Professor Bart Ehrman notes the Christians included Jesus in this, who was God's agapetos, or beloved, who was sent to restore the Davidic throne. Paul talks about the seed of David, for instance. But the response, he was tortured and killed. And so we get the idea of Luke's veil tearing before Jesus died to indicate that. The rabbis in the Talmud famously said the Second Temple fell because of Sinat Chinam, baseless hatred among the Jews, against framing national catastrophe as divine discipline for moral failure. And many Christians put the killing of Jesus right at the center of this. Okay, I'd like to talk a little bit about John the Baptist and show how we can sort of tie together Josephus with the Gospels on this point. There are major differences in how the death of John the Baptist is portrayed in the New Testament Gospels versus Flavius Josephus' Antiquities of the Jews. In the Gospels, Herod Antipas arrests John because the prophets publicly condemns Herod's marriage to Herodias, his living brother's wife, as unlawful. At Herod's birthday banquet, Herodias' daughter dances, pleases Herod, and prompted by her mother, demands John's head on a platter. Herod is reluctant, but executes John to honor his rash oath in front of guests. The scene is personal, domestic, and dramatic, driven by sexual immorality, family revenge, and Herod's weakness. John dies as a righteous prophet martyred for speaking the truth to power about marriage and ethics. But it's very different in Josephus. Herod Antipas executes John purely for political reasons. John is a good man who preaches righteousness, justice, piety, and baptism as a consecration of the body, not merely for forgiveness of sins. His preaching attracts huge crowds, which alarms Herod. Fearing sedition or revolt, they would have been guided by John in everything, Herod preemptively arrests John and sends him in chains to the fortress of Machaerus, where he is killed. No Herodias, no banquet, no dance, no oath, no moral criticism of the marriage. Josephus links the execution to divine punishment. Herod's later military defeat by King Aretas, Herodias' brother, is seen by many Jews as God's just vengeance for killing John. The key differences. In the Gospels, the motive is moral religious rebuke of Herod's incestuous marriage. In Josephus, it's political fear of John's popular influence leading to uprising. Setting and method. In the Gospels, intimate palace banquet with dramatic request and beheading. In Josephus, a straightforward arrest and execution at a remote desert fortress. No public spectacle described. Characters involved. In the gospel spotlight Herodias scheming in her daughter. Josephus mentions only Herod's suspicions. Herodias is absent. Theological framing. Gospels emphasize prophetic martyrdom and Herod's guilt. Josephus presents it as prudent realpolitik that backfires, with Jews interpreting the outcomes as divine retribution. The timing, the Gospels place it early in Jesus' ministry, around 28 to 30, and Josephus implies a later date of 35 to 36, though both agree Herod Antipas ordered it. So this is what I think happened with the death of John the Baptist, and it sort of gives us further understanding to see the Jewish elite killing Jesus. What the Gospels seem to have done is taken Josephus's account of the death of John the Baptist, and that's one reason I think Jacob Bergman is right that the Gospels reflect Josephus, and rework it to prefigure Jesus' death. This reflects literary allusion of John as the new and greater Elijah, and Jesus as the new and greater Elisha, with a double portion of Elijah's or John's power.
Absolutely.
Just as John, I'm sorry, what?
I just said absolutely. I'm agreeing. Continue.
Yeah. Just as John the Baptist is unjustly killed in the Gospels in a humiliating way by Herod Antipas, a Herodian ruler of mixed Idumean Jewish heritage, but operating as a Roman client king, Jesus is even more unjustly killed and humiliated thanks to the Jewish elite. We see a similar, should have pattern, in Luke, where we see a similar pattern in Luke Acts, where the forgiving death of Jesus anticipates the forgiving death of Stephen. On that passage, Ehrman thinks it's original to Luke, the forgiving Jesus, because it forms a pair with Stephen, and that it was actually removed from Luke by a Christian scribe who wouldn't believe that God would have forgiven the Jews for killing Jesus. So, but Ehrman thinks it was original to it. I think he's right. Okay. Coming to getting down to the end of it. Okay, so so Bart Ehrman has a conference every year, or at least he has had one every year, on new insights into the New Testament, it's called. And it brings a big collection of scholars to give papers that are meant for a non-specialist audience, but they're still they still reflect top-notch, cutting-edge scholarship. And at one of these, Pauline specialist Benjamin White took issue with the idea. This came up in the question and answer period. It wasn't part of his presentation, but he took issue with the idea that the First Thessalonians passage 14-16, where Paul says the Jews killed Jesus. Well, that's often dismissed as a later interpolation, but he thinks that it was very much original to Paul. And so I'll just get to what I wrote here. The Jews killed Christ in 1 Thessalonians 2:14-16. We know, going from the Dead Sea Scrolls, the various Jewish groups are always going after one another, so it would make sense Paul speaking to pagans complaining about the Jews he thought killed Christ. Paul was also an apocalyptic thinker, so the apocalyptic imagery in the passage need not refer to post-70 CE. I mean, it could have. Jacob puts the Pauline epistles later, so it would fit either way. We have passages like in Matthew, his blood be on us and our children passage, which is often dismissed because it's anti-Jewish. In Luke, we have the destruction of the temple was God's punishment for the Jews killing Jesus, along with a whole host of other terrible things that they were viewed as having done. And you ask, well, why didn't the Jews just kill Jesus himself then? We have a reason in the Gospel of John that says the Jews had to get the Romans to kill Jesus because God wouldn't let them kill Jesus themselves. And I mentioned the testimony in Flavianum where Jesus died because of the Jewish elite. But there's another parallel to that with Jesus and Ananias, which I'll get to in a second. But given these collected pieces of evidence as a whole, we can triangulate the death of Jesus toward the point of the culpability of the Jewish elite. There were many critics of the Jewish elite of Jesus' time, which I've noticed. And this is a personal favorite of mine, Jesus' Jewish trial. I wrote, perhaps the most scathing critique of the Jewish elite is the satirical trial where infraction after infraction of Jewish law and tradition happens, like having them meeting on Passover Eve, only to be twisted out of with loophole after loophole, like lawyers would do. So they're shown as being expert in the Jewish law, but ignoring the spirit of the law. Like they knew, like John said, they knew it wasn't for them to kill Jesus, so they figured out to get a way to get the Romans to do it. Scholar after scholar, from Ehrman to Ludemann, doubt the historicity of the trial, as it is little more than a caricature of the Jewish elite. We see something similar with Satan misusing Scripture to tempt Jesus in the temptations. The purpose is to amplify the wrongs done to Jesus. And this is sort of the idea of, like, when Jesus taught, when Josephus talks about Jesus and Annas, he sort of gives us a framework for what we would find later in the Gospels and why the Romans would sort of be exonerated and why the Jews would have done what they've done. I'll just read it to you, and then I'll go on. Why was Jesus' death universally blamed on the Jews and not Rome? The Jewish elite, not all Jews. Getting Rome to do what was too vile for their hands was a known technique for the Jewish elite. Analogously, according to the Jewish historian Josephus in the Jewish Wars, a peasant named Jesus, son of Ananus, also called Jesus ben Ananias, began loudly prophesying the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple around 62-63 during the Feast of the Tabernacles, repeating, crying, "Woe, woe to Jerusalem." So this would have been like Jesus, who was an apocalyptic prophet, and even more so with Paul, who thought Jesus's resurrection was the first fruits, and so the apocalypse had begun. Sorry, I'll get back. Jewish leaders seized him and beat him severely with many stripes. When he refused to stop, they handed him over to the Roman procurator Lucius Albinus to further punishment. Albinus had him scourged until his bones were laid bare, but eventually released him as a harmless madman. Jesus continued his warning for 7 years until he was finally killed by a stone from a Roman catapult during the siege of Jerusalem in 70 CE. This account confirms that the Jewish authorities deliberately used Roman assistance to inflict additional hard punishment on him. Judas was needed to point Jesus out and share. Well, this is my thought. Like, why? What's the point of Judas? Like, wouldn't the Romans have known who Jesus was if he was a great charismatic crowd leader? So Judas was needed to point Jesus out and share he was seditious because the Romans had no idea who he was. Okay, and so just to finish off, I'd like to talk about Bart Ehrman's model. I think Ehrman is going to be on Jacob's program soon to talk about his new book, Love Thy Stranger, which is really interesting for me because I think I think the idea of a Greek self-realization ethics transitioning to a Christian love of stranger and other ethics is really interesting. But anyway, so this is Bart's thoughts about the historical Jesus and the historical Paul and how it fits into what I've talked about before. Ehrman's basic thought seems to be there was a historical Jesus who, in the tradition of John the Baptist, taught a God who forgives you if you repent. Moreover, he taught a stricter interpretation of good works, such as with the rich young man, to get right with God, the young man needed to sell his possessions and give the money to the poor. This is also reflected in the story of the sheep and the goats. This idea of a God who forgives is reflected throughout the Hebrew Bible, such as with the penitential Psalms and the story of Jonah. Paul, by contrast, inverts or perverts Jesus' message and says things like, if righteousness comes via the law, then Christ died for nothing. The idea that God can't forgive you and so needs someone to pay your sin fine, as we see in Romans, is utterly un-Jesus-like. Jesus' actual death was random, not a sacrifice. Jesus' followers were armed and got violent at the arrest, the idea that Jesus was supposed to die never being on the radar. So my second slide is, Ehrman thinks what happened is soon after Jesus' death, some of his followers thought they saw him alive and so began to question if his death was not random but a God-intended sacrifice. Ehrman thinks this happened very early, encapsulated in such texts with the pre-Pauline Corinthian Creed. The idea that God can't forgive but just needs your faith in Jesus is the ultimate move to make the religion more accessible to the masses. Paul thus says the basic concept of faith is, quote, because if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. Nietzsche thus calls Pauline Christianity simple Platonism for the people that sees this life as a mistake. Paul saying, if the dead are not raised, we might as well indulge in food and drink, for tomorrow we die. Ehrman notes how we oddly seem to have the saving death of Jesus in Paul, but not in Q. Scholars, okay, I'm almost done here. So scholars like Ehrman and Fredrickson point out Paul's rulers of this age or archons of this ion passage as the ones who killed Christ refer to demons. Ehrman suggests this meant demons possessed the men who killed Jesus. So he wasn't killed by demons, as mythicists say, but that there was demons that influenced the rulers that killed Jesus. We see something similar in the Gospels with Satan entering Judas before he betrayed Jesus. I give a popular recent example of this is the figure of Ares in the Wonder Woman movie, who possessed people and made them do bad stuff. Paul says, for example, in Romans, the combination of cross and resurrection booted out the demons possessing you and made space to welcome the angelic possession of Christ in you. Paul says, without the resurrected Christ, your faith is futile. Paul says, without the resurrected Christ, your faith is futile and you are still in your sins because of the possessing demons. So Paul says it's not just the cross, but it's very much the resurrection that's needed to deal with sin. There are thus two models of sin in Romans, Paul's book Romans, or letter to the Romans. A sin fine that needs to be paid through atonement, and an evil entity sin that needs to be expelled and replaced by Christ in you. As I said earlier, with the wrongful death of Socrates, it is seeing ourselves in those who wrongfully killed God's beloved Jesus that opens our eyes in the sense of Adam had his eyes open too, and creates a revulsion toward our sinful disposition, and so expels the demon. And that's it.
All right, so I'm gonna take this super chat real quick, and then I'm gonna we'll go ahead about that topic. Solar Knight, thank you for your super chat. What crisis in second century?
I'm sorry. I'm just trying to get back to the screen to see you.
Okay. You just exit the full screen of your PowerPoint.
Okay, I see you now.
Okay. Solar Knight, thank you for your super chat. What crisis in second century necessitated the creation of character Paul to bridge the gap between Petrine Judaism and emerging Gentile church? Well, here's how I'm gonna put it. I don't think Paul was created because I'm not a Paul mythicist. Neither of us are. But what I will say, this is the closest thing I can get. This is the closest thing I could get to that is you have a convergence. You have emergence of three characters that are put together as the biblical Paul. You have the original one, Paul the Apostle. I date his death to around 39 AD or CE. Then you have Saulus's death in 66 CE. This is his appearance before Nero is mentioned by Josephus. Governed as Kostobaros up here before Nero, and Kostobaros and Saulus are both, I think, executed. I think it's implied. Josephus doesn't outright say they were both executed, but I think they were both killed. They never show up in the text again of Josephus after their appearance before Nero. Saulus's brother's name is actually pronounced Kostobaros instead of Costabarus, as I sometimes pronounce them. Anyway, Kostobaros and Saulus were killed in 66 CE, and that was the basis for the Acts of Paul, claiming that Paul was killed under Emperor Nero. That text comes from the late 2nd century CE. It was composed by Lucius Carinus or Lucius Carinus. And so that's primarily where we get the idea from, that Paul was killed under Emperor Nero. And then later on, you have the death of who I think is the actual author of the Pauline epistles, along with Timothy, Silas, and Sophanes, canonical Paul, that is Saul of Giscala. And he died, I think, of natural causes in 97 CE. So I think you have emergence of them all. Yes, to try to bring harmonization, but also to retroject 90 CE argumentation to the 30s. So I think there are multiple reasons why this conflation was done. Canonical Paul is already engaged in that conflation process himself. You see this in Romans 16, 2 Corinthians 11, and in Philippians. When he says he fled from King Aretas, there's no evidence that King Aretas IV ever controlled Damascus. This was a mistake. This is why I argue that, and I will be arguing in my paper, that Paul's letters also know Josephus, not just the Gospels. And just to be clear, in case I came off wrong, I'm not saying the Gospels predate Paul, the Gospels post-date Paul. But I'm claiming that both, not just the Gospels, but Paul's letters also know the text of Josephus. I think the mistake is 2 Corinthians 11 about which Aretas controlled Damascus is evidence of that. King Aretas III, according to Josephus, controlled Damascus in I believe he put it in the 70s BC or 60s BC, but I think it's 70s. So King Aretas III, a century earlier, controlled Damascus, not the fourth. There's no evidence the fourth controlled Damascus. In my paper, I cite, my forthcoming paper, I cite scholars going all over the map trying to explain this away. They know this is a problem. Even scholars that date the letters to the 50 CE still know that this is a problem. They try to overcome it, they can't. They admit that there is no external evidence that King Aretas IV ever controlled Damascus. They're simply believing it because 2 Corinthians says so. Well, in my view, that's ridiculous. If Acts can make mistakes, those same scholars will admit Acts makes mistakes. Why can't Paul make historical mistakes? Oh, well, if you admit that, you see where this is going. If you admit that canonical Paul can be wrong about that, then you're giving credence to the idea that 2 Corinthians and everything else are forged documents. They weren't written by him. he wouldn't make that kind of mistake. Make matters worse, Acts actually corrects 2 Corinthians. I know that because Acts relocates Paul's flight from Damascus 20, 30 years forward in time. So it's happening either in the 50s or 60s CE, depending on how you look at the chronology in Acts. And he's fleeing from not King Aretas, from Jews. Just like Saulus and Josephus was fleeing from Jews at the start of the Jewish War in 66 CE, when Herodium was set ablaze by the rebels. So Acts is borrowing from Josephus, from the guy that fled in the 60s, to give a more correct approach to Paul's so-called flight. You see my argument here, John?
Yeah.
So we're going to ditch the Aretas error, and we're going to say, well, he just fled later, like the guy in Josephus did. Now, I remember Derek asking me this question, asking me about Michael Kokonosh, because Michael Kokonosh argues that Saul becoming Paul is fictitious. And I explained, actually, I agree with that, and that doesn't contradict my argument about the recognitions one bit. If you read the recognitions, it's referring to the attacker of James as Saul as a polemic. It's not his actual name. That's just polemic. In the Clementine literature, if you look at First Clement, you look at the Clementine recognitions, there is no evidence of a transition from Saul to Paul. That's in Acts, in which Saul becomes Paul. Whereas in the Clementine literature, Saul and Paul are interchangeable. One doesn't become the other, but they're interchangeable references. You see my point? So,
and I think it's huge too that you're able to locate Paul so early with as a letter source for the Pseudo-Clementines, because that really blows up the idea of the Paul mythicism argument, where everything happened post-Marcion.
It does. I'm gonna pull this back up on the screen. So that I showed this in my presentation with Derek, and also in a video I did recently about correcting my views on the Hebrew gospel and the recognitions. Okay, so you see here the tumults raised by Saul, and I've noted that if you check the translators' material, you'll see that they note that Saul's name was removed from the text. Let me put this all the way on full screen. Saul's name is removed from the text by the author. Now, why did that happen? Because they were trying to hide that Saul attacked James. We actually have manuscript evidence of this. There is confirmation by a margin note and a manuscript for the text that Saul was named and identified as the leader of the attack on James the bishop. Now, there is one thing I do want to note. This is something that, and I'll go back to the presentation in a second after I note this. I'm becoming a bit more convinced now that Jesus' death may have happened slightly earlier than conventionally thought. If you look at the testimonium and where it's placed in Josephus, it's curious. It's just, he said about this time. And what's interesting about that is what happened at about this time that he introduces Jesus. The aqueduct incident in 26 CE, when Pilate sent soldiers after Jews who were protesting because of I believe it was an aqueduct that was being constructed. And the way it was being handled, they were very angry about this. Josephus introduces the ministry of Jesus and the crucifixion of Jesus just after that is mentioned. And I believe that could indicate he was crucified in 26 CE rather than 30. We only get the 30 CE dating from the Gospels. I just want everybody to understand that. All of that comes from the Gospels. Josephus, if you read the text without the Gospels in mind, he seems to be putting to death a little earlier. It's still in Pilate's reign, just at the beginning part of it, and not halfway through it or later. And to capitalize on your point that you made during your presentation, John, that John the Baptist, Josephus makes no connection with him. I made that point myself recently. John the Baptist dies after Jesus. The Gospels make the connections between the two. We really have, I don't even think there's any reason to think John even baptized Jesus. How do we know he did that? Or the other way around, that Jesus baptized John? We have no data to support that happened except the Gospels, and Josephus is not aware of it. It's funny, he'll make a connection between the James, the not brother of Jesus, in the James passage, the spiritual brother of Jesus, with the historical Jesus, but he will not make any link between John and Jesus. I find that curious. All right, let's get back to the PowerPoint. Yeah, so if Jesus' death is in 26 CE, then the attack on James happened 10 years later. If you put Jesus' death in 30, well, or 32 CE, then it's just a 4-6 year difference. But regardless, I go with 26 CE because I think it's a little safer, because I'm sticking just with Josephus. And the Gospels, when it comes to the Gospels, I think the reason Jesus' death was moved to 30 was to fit the 40-year cycle. In a way, you were kind of, from a different angle, you were also talking about how they're trying to make that work together with the destruction of the Second Temple, put words in Jesus' mouth about predicting the destruction of the temple. And in the Joshua typology, and I recommend Richard Onsworth's book on the Joshua typology, because he really gets into this. The Joshua material in the Old Testament is being reused in the Gospels to rewrite Jesus. And you have the 40-year cycle, which is part of that. So basically what the Gospels do is they round up Jesus's death. They round up, it's like, oh, well, it's close to 30 CE, so we're just going to put it on 30. That way it lines up mathematically with 70 CE when the temple is destroyed. So I just want to bring that point up real quick. That will also be included in my paper. And that was part of the reason I was delayed on the paper. On top of that, finalizing my views on the Pseudo-Clementine recognitions, I wanted to come to a more hard stance on when I think Jesus' death happened. And I think I've gotten there, 26 CE. But anyway, there are other scholars like Bartosz Adamczewski that will put Jesus' death in the 20s, but I think he puts it later. 27 or 29 CE, I can't remember. One of those years. But he does put it earlier like I do. But anyway. This is the point I was making earlier. Saul does not become Paul in the Clementine literature. He does in the book of Acts. Now, as I explained to Derek, again, I want everybody to look at this real quick. Again, tumult raised by Saul. And now, if you look at First Clement and what First Clement says about Paul, he's very positive about Paul. He doesn't speak negatively about him. He's positive about him. And so what's happening is Acts is trying to harmonize Zacchaeus' letter, which is the text talking about Saul's attack on James being quoted by the recognitions, with First Clement. You see where I'm going with that, John?
Yeah.
So if you combine them together, the explanation is Saul became Paul. That's a way of harmonizing the polemic. It says, okay, well, Saul was his old life. Now he's conveniently become Paul. He has shed himself of the evil. Now he's a redeemed person. And so, and to that extent, I do agree with Michael Kokenosh, but for a different reason. Because, yes, Acts lifts language from the Old Testament about, Saul, Saul, why have you persecuted me? But even canonical Paul is already engaged in that conversation. Because if you look at Philippians, why is Paul called a Benjamite? It may not call him Saul. That's not the point, though. It's implying it by saying such a thing. It's saying he's a Benjamite because that's the link Paul persecuting the followers of Jesus that's talked about in the epistles with the Old Testament Saul persecuting King David. Or King Saul persecuting David. So I just wanted to make that point real quick. So again, this is where Zacchaeus had written to him. That's where I note that right there. Let's see. Yeah. So again, that's where you find it. It's in Recognitions, Book 1, Chapter 72. And this is important. This is Abdias of Babylon, quoted by so-called Pseudo-Dorotheus Attire. It's kind of hard to read, but I got it highlighted right there. But I saw afterward called Paul thrown down and having breath after his fall. One came of a fuller's club and knocked him upon the head and brained him. So the attack is finished. And this is important because somebody might argue, oh, well, the recognition doesn't really mention James's death, so maybe he survived. No, he was finished off with near immediacy. This text shows that. He did not live. There's no way you can read that and say, okay, he died decades later. Dr. Robert Eisenman talks about this, but he talks about the recognitions, but he fails to talk about pseudo-Dorotheus. He never talks about pseudo-Dorotheus. He's totally unaware of this. Because Robert Eisenman attempts to harmonize it. And I ripped this to shreds in my paper. It's a horrible argument, with all due respect to Eisenman. He tries to say, well, he survived the attack in 36. He puts it in the 40s, actually, for some reason. But really happened in the 30s. And then he's attacked again, and this time he's actually killed in 62 CE. No, that's ridiculous. That's like listening to a Christian apologist argue that Judas's death in Matthew works with Acts. Oh, well, he hung himself and his guts exploded. Come on. Nobody except apologists believe that. I'm going to skip that. So there was a second Clement of Rome. I was talking about that earlier. The shepherd of Hermas mentions, and shall send one to Clement and one to Grapti. So Clement shall send to the foreign cities, for this is his duty. The original Clement of Rome, who was bishop, wasn't dealing with this kind of stuff. He wasn't working with a bunch of foreign cities. So this is a non-bishop second Clement of you can call him second Clement of Rome, and I think this is the same guy that wrote second Clement. And when is he active? Well, the Moratorium fragment says that Hermas, who wrote the Shepherd, is the brother of Bishop Pius. When was Bishop Pius reigning? And this is why I said I made a mistake on the PowerPoint the other day. I'm going to include the same image again, but corrected with 142 to 157 AD, because he reigned for 15 years, not 14. So I was off by 1 year, but I wasn't really, that's hardly anything. But the point is, it's still the same time period I was talking about. And so that puts the recognitions in the mid-2nd century. Let's say, to be on the safe side, I say circa 150 AD or CE. Origins Philokalia, I have the text right here. If you read that first bullet point, and Clement of Rome, in his argument with his father at Laodicea, has some comments on the question before us. The passage occurs in the Travels, which agree with the foregoing. Towards the end, he speaks with great force on the seeming results of Nativity, Book 10. He knows about a Book 10. That means he knew about 10 books. That's it. He knows about a 10-book Travels of Clement. That's the recognitions. That's what he's talking about. Eusebius does know about it, but he refers to it in a different way. He talks about, but it must be observed also that there is said to be a second epistle of Clement, but we do not know that this is recognized like the former, for we do not find that the ancients have made any use of it. As certain men have lately brought forward other wordy and lengthy writings under his name, containing dialogues of Peter and Appian. But no mention has been made of these by the ancients, for they do not even preserve the pure stamp of apostolic orthodoxy. The acknowledged writing of Clement is well known. We have spoken also of the works of Ignatius and Polycarp. Now, here's something else this is going to be very interesting, and this will be talked about in my Paul paper, because the recognitions is absolutely central to the paper. But it also is going to be for a separate paper in which I argue. I may do a separate paper on this, but I might not bother because I'm going to be discussing this anyway in the same Paul paper, so it might be redundant. But anyway, the recognitions appears to be familiar with Papias. And it's interesting because you look at the order. Look at the order of that stuff. So Papias mentions Matthew, Andrew, John, Peter, Thomas, James, Philip. And if you go to second Clement, the order is identical. Matthew, Andrew, John, Peter, Thomas, James, Philip. So they both name the same people in a similar and about the same identical order in both texts. And what Papias talks about is he groups them together as authors of various logia, sayings. And what does recognitions do? Rather than providing just a list, he provides the names and sayings material and actually quotes them for each name he talks about. What do you think about that, John?
Hell of a coincidence.
I don't think it is.
I'm kidding.
Yeah, I know you're kidding.
Yeah.
I don't think that's a coincidence. I think I'll come back to that in a second. We got a super chat. I should tell you, thank you for your super chat. For your insight, Simon Peter and Clementines is Simon Clopas. Okay. But I think what's happening in the recognitions is I think it's also responding, I think, polemically against Papias. Now, unfortunately, we can't access exactly how it's doing that because we lost almost everything Papias wrote, except for those tiny fragments. We're lucky to have what we got as it is. So the recognitions looks like it's responding to and mimicking Papias, but we cannot fully assess it at this time until Papias's works are discovered, if ever. The Caracalla dating and recognitions refuted. Now this is absolute nonsense. The Caracalla dating of recognitions comes from some scholars arguing that Emperor Caracalla's decree that everyone in the empire, his sweeping decree that everybody shall become citizens, no matter if they were from Rome or not, from the empire or not. They claim that the recognitions knows about that decree. Now, John, you saw on my stream, I went through all 7 instances of the word citizen. And I'm also doing the same thing in the paper. Not a single time ever is the word citizen used in such a way as to denote that everyone became citizens of the empire like that.
No, and sometimes it suggested the opposite.
I know. Yeah, and that was the point of me going through each and every single quote. That's the problem that I have with that claim. So it's easily refuted. Easily. It wouldn't take me long. I guess I could do that again. Why not? The first use of citizen is in chapter 7 of, I believe it's book 1. Hear me, O citizens of Rome, the sons of God is now in the regions of Judea, promising eternal life to everyone who will hear him, but upon condition that he shall regulate his actions according to the will of him by whom he has sent, even of God the Father. Sounds like a distinction is being made to me right there, not a conflation of everybody to become citizens. If you're we're going to look at chapter 9 of book 1. If your intemperance and lust did not oppose, it ought to have been a citizen and a native. Now we're going to look at chapter 13. Just make sure I got the book number. Book 1. Okay. And shall enroll you a citizen of her own city, and then there shall be a great joy to you, because imparting a small favor, you shall be written heir of eternal blessings. Let me read that whole thing, actually. You shall be blessed, for as you deemed an ambassador of truth worthy of all honor, so the truth herself shall receive you a wanderer and stranger, and shall enroll you a citizen of her own city, and then there shall be a great joy to you, because imparting a small favor, you shall be written heir of eternal blessings. So again, that sounds like applying to become a citizen. That does not make any sense with a sweeping order from Caracalla, suggesting that everybody became citizens at the same time. So now we're going to look at Book 4, Chapter 2. Then he learned from the brethren who had been sent before, but the citizens had received them not only hospitably, but with all kindness, by reason of their love towards Peter, so much so that several were disappointed because there were no guests for them. For that all had made such preparations that even if many more had come, there would still have been a deficiency of guests for the hosts, not of hosts for the guests. Again, another distinction is being made here. Okay, let's see where I'm at now. Book 7, Chapter 20. Then Peter, incapable of deception and moved with compassion, began to say, there is a certain young man among those who follow me for the sake of religion and sect, a Roman citizen, who told me that he had a father and 2 twin brothers, of whom not one is left to him. Almost done. Just got 2 more instances. We're now at Book 9. All right. Let's see here. For our first birth descends through the first of, let me start over on that. For our first birth descends through the fire of lust, and therefore by the divine appointment. The second birth is introduced by water, which may extinguish the nature of fire. Sounds a lot like the fire and water baptism we see in Matthew and Luke. And that the soul, enlightened by the heavenly spirit, may cast away the fear of the first birth, provided, however, it so live for the time to come, that it did not at all seek after any of the pleasures of this world, but be as it were a pilgrim and a stranger and a citizen of another city. Last one. Let me see which book this is. Okay, that's also Book 9. So Book 9, Chapter 35. When he had said this, he turned to the crowds and thus began, this person whom you see, O men, in this poor garb, is a citizen of the city of Rome, descended of the stock of Caesar himself. So now that I've gone over all 7 instances, I'm guessing it's still, to you, John, does not sound anything like a Caracalla era situation.
No, not at all.
Yeah, so the argument is ridiculous, and I don't even know what gave somebody the idea to argue this. It is beyond me, beyond my comprehension at this time. I think somebody, my guess is it was misread. Maybe that statement, one of the statements that I read earlier about enrolling to become a citizen might have been taken the wrong way by the scholar that came up with this ridiculous idea. But the other argument I'm going to be addressing, and I haven't addressed this fully yet in public, but I'll do so now, is the Bardasian argument, or Bardasian of Edessa is being quoted by the recognitions, because it has to do with astrology. Well, here's the problem with that. Bardasian, the material supposedly paralleling him, recognitions never says he got it from their work. Yes, they do overlap on the discussion of astrology. But the recognitions, if I remember correctly, was treating astrology, I can't remember, but I think it might have been positive. Whereas in Bardasian, it's negative. It's a negative treatment. I might have that inverted. I have to double check that. But what I can tell you with certainty is the recognition does not claim that it quotes Bardasian at all. And the dependence can be easily reversed. If you look up when Bardasian was born, he was born in like the 150s, possibly later, at the height of actually, I think it's pretty much 150s. But that's at the height. That would be at the height of Clement's activity. You see the problem there? So if Bardasian is born later, then the overlap would indicate he's dependent on the recognitions and not the reverse. So it's a very weak argument. Very weak argument. Ked, thank you for your super chat. Is it true that Clement was under pressure to organize a canon? And is it true that his influence led to the inclusion of many of the New Testament gospel and letters? Not to my knowledge. If there was a Clement that was involved in any attempt to organize canon, it would have been the second guy. The first guy was writing in the 90s, and he was talking about Paul. He says he knows about a letter and the gospel. I need to clear something up. So I think I still think the gospel that Clement's talking about, Paul's gospel, is the apocalypse of Elijah, but church fathers refer to as being quoted by canonical Paul. I think it was a mistake by the church fathers to call it the apocalypse of Elijah because they were looking at Old Testament quotations in the gospel of Paul, and they called it the apocalypse of Elijah, but it really wasn't that. It was a gospel. My current reconstruction of it, that reminds me, I gotta send you my reconstruction on that, John. We've been talking about that, but I already reconstructed the text. It's nothing. It's pretty much what it is. It's a creedal statements in the canonical letters. That's what it is. And if you look at the creedal statements by themselves, you can easily see how that was written before 70, because none of the creedal statements are aware of the destruction of the temple. One of those statements has to do with the 500 guys seeing Jesus. Mm-hmm. That could not have been written in the 90s. That had to be much, much earlier, because some of the 500 were still alive. That's what Paul was saying. Some of them are still with us. But he's implying that most of them are dead, probably killed in a rebellion. Anyway, dating recognitions. I forgot to correct that part of the slide. Thought I corrected that part of the slide. I did. What happened was I just didn't upload the correction yet. I can do that. I'm going to do that right now. Just give me a second. Okay, here we go. Essentially, what I'm doing there is I'm summarizing my argument on why I put the recognitions in circa 150. That's basically what I'm doing. But I think going to the apocalypses of James, like I've done, is a better argument to explain why Josephus wrote that James passage, rather than trying to argue, it's an interpolation. Because I know if I were to go there, I wouldn't go there anyway without manuscript evidence. But if I were to go there and say that, somebody could easily claim I'm trying to bend the evidence to fit my theory that James died earlier. But that's not what I'm doing. Let's see. Here we are. So given the composition of the Shepherd of Hermas being placed by the moratorium fragment during the reign of Bishop Pius I, who reigned from 142 AD to 157 AD, and since Hermas mentioned Clement and his traveling activities during that bishop's reign, this means that the Clementine recognitions in its original form prior to modification in the early 5th century AD by Tyrannus Rufinus was composed during that reign. So that's i.e. 142 to 157 AD. The formation of recognition. So with the correction there at the bottom left, I got 142 to 157 instead of 142 156, which was slightly incorrect. I think my suspicion is that the original Clement, the Bishop of Rome, probably acted as a preserver. I think he acted as a preserver of the original text, which is why that material was available to Second Clement of Rome in the mid-2nd century. So you can add that material. You can use that material in the creation of the highly fictionalized quasi-historical fiction, that is the so-called Pseudo-Clementine recognitions, while the actual letters go back to the late AD 30s. And you can use that corrected image right there, John. That has the 142 to 157 rather than the other one. But anyway, to close, what I'm basically, the James passage, the way it's phrased, and it's interesting because I'm halfway there with the interpolation theorist about the James passage. Like, that's not James, brother of Jesus. Well, I agree, but for a different reason. I think it's genuine. But rather than just trying to say somebody later got confused, because John, I think you'll agree with me, the argument that somebody interpolated that into Josephus by accident because they were confused, that doesn't make any sense.
No.
Origen quoted the passage, he was very negative about it too. He didn't like it. And I think he knew about the testimonium, but I think the reason that Origen didn't quote it was because he was confused by Josephus's views. And I talked about that a little bit with Dr. T.C. Schmidt. And I think T.C. Schmidt makes a very good argument that about the testimonium, although I think the whole thing is authentic. He will say there might have been one tiny modification to it, but scholars are moving in the trajectory of saying the whole thing is authentic. And the only people that don't like, and the people that are upset about that are mythicists that are screaming and throwing a tantrum, and right now there are people defaming him and trying to say that he's a fraud or he's comparable to Amon Hillman, which is ridiculous, childish. They just hate Jesus, don't want him to exist. You can, especially, I'm not saying all mythicists hate Jesus, but some of them, they seem like that to me. They just have an emotional entanglement of not wanting him to exist, while also projecting and claiming that historicists have that same problem. So it's hilarious, really. But I think I think Mark Madison noted the parallel between the apocalypses of James and Josephus, because the James in Josephus was put to death by the Sanhedrin. The apocalypses of James have the same problem. I'm sorry, not same problem, but the same thing. The James is stoned to death. They're both stoned to death. And so it's the same guy. But the apocalypses tell you it's a spiritual brother of Jesus. It's funny because mythicists wish Galatians said that. But the apocalypses actually go there. He is not the material brother of Jesus. So that's the point that I try to make to mythicists. When a text wants you to know it's spiritual, it tells you. It's not vague about it. It actually tells you. Galatians isn't telling you that because it's trying to give you the impression James is talking about is the Lord's brother. But the apocalypses are trying to tell you, no. This guy really is a spiritual brother of Jesus. I'm making it clear. And that I think explains why Josephus wrote the James passage in the very odd way he did. James, the brother of Jesus, called the Christ. Why put it that way? Because I think he was aware that he really wasn't the brother of Jesus. But Josephus also didn't really care enough. I really don't think he cared enough into actually saying, let me explain what I meant by that. I don't think he wanted to do that. So I think he wanted to explain it in a different way, so he didn't have to get into the business of explaining the brother bit. So I think he was just trying to save time. And also because he was interested in Jesus and James, but not interested enough into getting into those details, if you get my point. So that's why I put it. Now, I've been asked in the chat if I read Steve Mason's response to Schmidt. I had Dr. Steve Mason on himself to discuss his response to Schmidt. Before I discuss that, let me take this super chat real quick. Ked, thank you for another super chat. At first, Clement is written in the 90s. And why is he 1 Corinthians, Matthew, Luke, etc., and those works are apparently 2nd century? He never mentions Matthew and Luke. Okay, so I see that we have a problem here. You're under the false impression that Clement knew 1 Corinthians. Okay? Let's take a look at the actual text that talks about... okay, I'm going to pull up the actual passage, okay? You see that screen? Let me zoom in. Is that more legible now? Let me do it. Let me go further. That's better. Okay, so here's the problem, okay? So you have Paul being bound 7 times in chains. That's not something we get in the New Testament. That's actually a contradiction of the New Testament. So where the hell is Clement getting that from? He made it farthest west of the empire, which means that Romans is a forgery acting as a prequel when he said, oh, I'm planning to go to Hispania, which is farthest west of the empire. Now let's see. Where's this so-called quote coming from? So First Clement 47:1, the epistle. Let me fix this. Take up the epistle of the blessed Paul the apostle. What you notice? You notice something, Ked? You know we know what he doesn't do here. He doesn't tell you the title of it. That's something I want all of you to think about. There's no title. He only knows one letter. He uses the Greek word epistolon. That's a letter. That's not letters. Epistolase, what you see in 2 Peter. And here's the only bit that he quotes from that letter. Of a truth, he charged you in the spirit concerning himself and Cephas and Apollos, because that even then ye had made parties. So he's criticizing the multiple parties. So let me correct myself. He knows about, I do think he quotes the letter elsewhere in the text, although here it's more clear. So he doesn't know the full text. He only knows that. And Ked, how about this? I want you to riddle this for me. You ready for this? Oh yeah, and the quote continues on here. Yet that making of parties brought less sin upon you, for you were partisans of apostles that were highly reputed and of a man approved in their sight. All right, I want you all to think about this. First Clement's writing to the Corinthians, right? We all know that. Do you know what he failed to do? He's not very clear that he wrote to the Corinthians. Now, you could argue against that because of the way he uses the word you. For parties brought less sin upon you. What he wrote unto you in the beginning of the gospel. What gospel is that? You see my problem, John? So it's being quoted, and it looks like he's changing the context to make it look to try to fit the Corinthian situation. But the original Paul, he's not even writing a letter to the Corinthians. If the letter had the title Epistle to the Corinthians, because if you read the beginning of 1 Corinthians, okay, which is what it says. Hold on. Here we go. Paul, called to be an apostle of Jesus Christ through the will of God, and Sophanes, our brother, unto the church of God, which is at Corinth. Why doesn't he quote that to make it clear? And by the way, Sophanes is never mentioned here either. Ever. None of the co-authors are named here. In fact, they're not even in the Pseudo-Clementine literature, which is hilarious. That just says something right there. So I think what they did is they took this letter and they put the material in it in 1 Corinthians, and they scattered it into the other letters. And I think they did the same thing with Paul's gospel, which became the creedal statements. They were scattered across the letters. Clement does not know our canonical letters. There's no way. He didn't know them. He absolutely did not know them. He knows something much smaller. Some desperate to defend Marcion priority try to say he knows Marcion's text. You can't say that either. Why isn't he saying he knows letters in plural? But you still have a problem with the lack of plurality. So I hope you understand. I hope you understand my problem, kid. Oh, he does. He says, I think you're onto something, Jacob. Well, thanks. Yeah, it's just to make it worse, Clement doesn't even know about Paul's vision. I want y'all to think about that. He doesn't even know about Paul's vision. He never. There's no evidence that he used Second Corinthians at all, to my knowledge. I've not seen a good argument that Clement knows Second Corinthians, any of the material in it. You have the 7 times in bonds, 7 times in chains, right? But there's no shipwrecks. There's no shipwrecks talked about by Clement. He doesn't know about it. He just forgot that looking at the Corinthian letters. Are you kidding me? Here's interesting. Actually, Acts is descaling these shipwrecks. It's not expanding on it. Because in 2 Corinthians, there's 3 shipwrecks, and Acts is only 1. I'll show y'all one more thing, and then I'm gonna close because I'm kind of repeating material I've talked about before. But this is one of my favorite bits of evidence here. Okay, so I'm gonna share screens and show y'all. But the death of Solus and Costobarus, I meant to say, in the Wars of the Jews by Josephus. Costobarus and Solus, right there. Look at that. After this calamity had befallen Cestius, many of the most eminent of the Jews swam away from the city as from a ship when it was going to sink. Costobarus, therefore, and Solus, who were brethren together with Philip. So notice he uses the metaphor, sinking ship. So they're not on a ship that's actually sinking, John. It's a metaphorical sinking ship representing the calamity in the region. And notice that after they ran away from the city and went to Cestius, it says they're saying, but then how Antipas, who had been besieged with them in the king's palace, but would not fly away with them, was afterwards slain by the seditious. We shall relate hereafter. However, Cestius sent Saul and his friends at their own desire to Achaia to Nero to inform him of the great distress they were in and to lay the blame of their kindling of the war upon Florus, as hoping to alleviate his own danger. See that right there? His own danger. By provoking his indignation against Florus. In the meantime, so they never show up. Saul and Costobarus never show up ever again. In the meantime, the people of Damascus, when they were informed of the destruction of the Romans, set about the slaughter of those Jews that were among them, and as they had them already coped up together in the place of public exercises, which they had done out of the suspicion they had of them, they thought they should meet with no difficulty in the attempt, yet did they distrust their own wives, which were almost all of them addicted to the Jewish religion, on which account it was that their greatest concern was how they might conceal these things from them. So they came upon the Jews and cut their throats, as being in a narrow place in number 10,000, and all of them unarmed, and this in 1 hour's time without anybody to disturb them. Okay, so you have a Damascus situation just after Solus and Costobarus are mentioned. I think the pronunciation might be Costobarus. I need to double check that after this stream. Anyway, regardless, my point stands, and that is, you might know where I'm going with that, John, but the flight from Damascus in Acts. I think that's what this is. But I also think that even the author of 2 Corinthians, Saul of Cascala and Timothy, I think they saw this too, but they treated it differently. They decided to fabricate this flight from King Aretas IV, but not ruler of Damascus. Yeah. I've seen people pronounce Costobarus in so many different ways. I really have to.
Do you mind if I just add one thing I forgot to mention earlier?
Sure.
What sort of this brings to mind too when we're talking about Paul and who he was and stuff like that. It's interesting for me that this was interesting for Nietzsche too, that Paul was supposedly from Tarsus, because what was Tarsus in the ancient world? Well, it was the birthplace of the Stoic Enlightenment. So you have this great conflagration of Greek ideas and then the Jewish ideas, and that's what Paul said. He said, or that's what the writer said, Paul said, was, to the Jews I was a Jew, and to the Greeks I was a Greek. And you get this played out in Romans. Ehrman asks, well, how is it in Romans that we have two completely different models of sin? Like, we have the fine that needs to be paid model with substitutionary atonement, but then a few paragraphs later you have the idea that sin is a terrible demonic entity that needs to be overcome. And the idea of a fine that has to be paid, that certainly makes sense within the Jewish understanding of atonement. But the idea of entities being displaced, that's a Greek idea. Like in the Phaedo, at the end of the Phaedo, Socrates is talking to his friend after he takes the poison, and he says, let us offer a rooster for Asclepius, because this poison is a cure. And it's like, well, what was it a cure for? Well, that points back to Plato's Republic and the idea of it's better to be an impaled just man than a wicked ruler, because through Socrates' death, we get to see that society is inherently corrupt and needs to be helped and fixed. And so it opens people's eyes, like Adam's eyes were opened when he ate the fruit. So even the idea, sorry for wandering, but even the idea that Saul is from Tarsus forms a very, very interesting particular connection to the fusing of Greek thought and Jewish thought. That's it.
It looks like, the more I look at it, I think it's probably like a mix of a couple of those pronunciations. I think it's like Costobarus, which actually sounds more right. I'll just go off that for now on. But his name is also conveniently abbreviated to Kosovar, which is another thing I could just call him. Anyway, Ked, thank you for your super chat. I don't have a problem quoting Josephus, but the 800 million pound elephant in the room is that he has Jesus dead before John the Baptist. Yeah, it's not really a problem if you understand that that's true, and that's actually an argument against interpolation. Why would you put Jesus' death before John? So Dr. Samuel Zinner points that out. Jesus' death before John contradicts the gospel order. I think the Gospels flipped it because they wanted John to be a subordinated to Jesus. And if you look at the Gospel of Thomas, it's also suggested that John will be the successor to not only Jesus, but to James too. So that means that John actually had to die after James to take over, which from the evidence here, that's exactly what happened. James died before John did, but in the same year. But what is also interesting is you have, and I have to talk about that later because I think there's a strong connection between the Mandeans and what the Pseudo-Clementine recognitions talks about, with Simon Magus being the founder of a movement that seems to be implied to have perverted John's teachings. It's kind of making out Simon Magus to be the John the Baptist movement's version of Paul, their equivalent of Paul. So Paul perverts the message of Jesus as Simon perverts the message of John. I think that's the potential interpretation of what's going on there. But yeah, I only have really just a few more handful of pages left to write for the paper before it's done. I think it could, I'm not going to say with certainty, but I think it could be done this week. I'd like to get it done before the debate I have with a friend of mine, John Winford, which is going to be this Saturday, on the authenticity of Paul's letters. Were they written after 70 or were they written by Paul before 70? And y'all know what I'm going to say. And John's gonna try to defend the consensus position. But one of the things I am going to throw in that debate is Fortunatus. Fortunatus is mentioned by Clement as a contemporary in his time. That's another piece of evidence that he doesn't know 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians mentions Fortunatus. Paul and Fortunatus were familiar with one another. Clement doesn't know Fortunatus knew Paul. In the second to last verse in his letter to the Corinthians, First Clement does not know that Fortunatus knew Paul. He says that Fortunatus is still alive in his time. He does not know Fortunatus as being a contemporary of Paul. That's a problem. Which is it? Who's lying? Is First Clement lying, or is First Corinthians lying? I think it's the latter. You see the same problem with Philippians. How does Paul and Clement know each other if Clement died before Paul did? You see, in First Clement, he knows about Paul's death as happening decades in the past, never said he met Paul. But in Philippians, Clement knew Paul. They knew each other. I would think Clement would have told us, hey, Paul didn't die in ancient times. I knew him. He doesn't say that at all. And Saul of Giscala, of course, outlives Clement. And so he couldn't possibly have died. He couldn't have been the same guy as a Paul that died before Clement did. So that's a contradiction that cannot be resolved. But anyway, I think that wraps it up right there nicely. And I just want to remind everybody real quick that I'll have the links to John's books and his website in the description below and the pinned comment. And that being said, John, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thanks, Jacob.
Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and/or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.